Welcome to the 28th Annual Writers' Symposium by the Sea at Point Loma Nazarene University. I'm Dean Nelson on the journalism faculty at the university. Today we have with us the great N. Scott Momaday, novelist, poet, playwright, Native American scholar, described by the New York Times as the Dean of Native American Writers. He brings the landscape alive, he brings the culture alive, he brings ancestors alive with his writing. And we're doing the interview just a little different this time. We're here in chilly Santa Fe, New Mexico, where we'll be conducting our interview with Dr. Momaday in the comfort of his living room. Scott Momaday, welcome to the Writers' Symposium by the Sea.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we're thrilled that you would open your home to us, so thank you.
You're welcome.
You have said that all stories come from one cell, one story, and the original story. What is that story?
I don't know. It can be any number of things. The important point is that there is one story, but there are many stories in the one. And tracing down, trying to find out what the original story was is impossible.
But that's the attempt of writing, right?
That's right.
Is to drill into it.
Yeah. I think I wrote somewhere that the story has to do with a man who goes out on pilgrimage and comes back to his home, a hero, and his wife has been faithful or unfaithful, and his son has become important in the story. But it's a story of pilgrimage, I think, you know. And that's repeated again and again and again in my culture anyway. So makes for good storytelling.
Well, you've also said that the original story and that all stories come out of this root of God's pursuit of man. You've said that in the past too, which struck me as different because I would have thought it would be the other way around. It would be man's pursuit of God. But what does that mean, God's pursuit of man?
I think I heard that in something that was said by an actor at one time. He was talking about having purchased a painting by a French painter, and he was very proud to have this new painting in his possession. And the title of the painting was God's Pursuit of Man. And I thought, that makes sense, you know. We're all pursued by God.
And that's where these creative urges are always addressing that? Is that what you mean?
Well, largely anyway, yes. I think that's a dominant theme in literature, and probably in painting and other forms of art.
When you mentioned the Pilgrim's Journey, I was thinking of Joseph Campbell and his discussion of myth and the hero's journey and pilgrimage. But you connect ancient myths differently from how he described them. You are connecting to the story of the Kiowa people and of Native American people. So do you ever think of myth in the way Joseph Campbell did, where it's the hero?
Certainly, I know Joseph Campbell, and I have a high regard for him, and I'm very much interested in myth. I like to quote Borges, who said that myth is at the beginning of literature and also at its end. And that's a good thing to keep in mind as you're writing or painting.
But you're always drawn to the myths of where the Kiowa people came from. Is that true?
It's very important in my mind and in my work. You know, the origin myth of the Kiowas has it that they came into the world through a hollow log, and I like that figure, that image, and I've always wondered what was on the other side of the log. I don't know, no one does, but you know, it's fun to speculate.
Oh, I agree. You know, I'm thinking. You knew you wanted to be a writer. I think it was at age 8. You told your mom that you wanted to be a writer. How did she react to that?
I think she said, good.
Because she was a writer.
She was a writer herself. So I think she was pleased that I was thinking in those terms. But it's clear to me now, Dean, that you know more about my life than I do. So maybe I should be interviewing you.
Yes, I'll tell you when your answers are correct and when they're
thank you.
incorrect.
All
Sure.
right.
Sure.
Good.
But a mentor told you to imitate people you admired. And one of the people that you started to imitate was Robert Frost. Why Frost? There are a lot of great poets. He's one of them, but why Frost?
I think he's very accessible, for one thing. He writes in a very plain style, and it's easy to read him. And he can teach you a lot about poetry. I think you may be referring to a priest who was at Jemez Pueblo when I was there. He was the postmaster, and a great poet, Fray Angelico Chavez. And I used to go down, and when the mail was distributed, I would corner him and talk about poetry. And he said, don't be afraid to imitate writers that you admire, because you will eventually find your own voice. And I think that's true. It was good advice.
That is good advice. Yeah, eventually your own voice, your own perspective develops. But yeah, I mean, why not start there? Why not start with the great ones?
Yeah, exactly.
So you've written a lot just about the concept of what words do and what stories do. And I think a lot of us intuitively already know the value of a word or the value of a story, but you've actually thought about this and you've articulated that words have power. So I want to hear your explanation of what are words.
Words do have power. In fact, offhand, I can think of nothing more powerful. Words are sacred. Language is sacred. I'm interested in the origin of language. We don't know when it began or where or how, but I like to speculate that, in fact, it was, what writer am I thinking of now, who wrote The Fragile Species and the Origin of a Cell?
Lewis Thomas?
Yes. Lewis Thomas has a book called The Fragile Species, in which there is a chapter entitled Communication, which is bad word, bad title, I think. But he says, I think I know how language began. There were people living in caves, and they were having a hard time communicating with each other. They were growling and, But he said, one day, a neighboring tribe came across the ridge to visit. They spent the day, but they brought their children with them. And suddenly, he said, we had a critical mass of children. They played all day long, and at the end of that day, we had language. And I think that makes a lot of sense, because children, they're not afraid of language. They love to play with it, and that's what you need. As we grow older, we have less sympathy, less appreciation of language, I think, but it's there and it's sacred, and we don't know what the limits of language are.
No, and that story, which is beautiful, I hadn't read it, but it actually amplifies what you have said in the past, where you wrote once, words are the intricate bonds of language. Words make a family, a tribe, and a civilization. Language is the context of our experience. People had experiences before they had language, though, right? So what does language do that helps family, tribe, civilization?
It interprets the feelings of people. You say there were things before language, of course, but those things needed expression. The expression that language gives them. And when you have that combination, that formula, you have something to build on, and becomes the rock of civilization, yes.
You're saying language is the rock of civilization?
I think I would say that, yes. You want to fight about it?
No, I want you to tell me why. Well, I'm not interested in fighting you.
Oh, all right. How can I better put it? People were living together, before they had language. Okay, that's a given. There was a time when that was true, and with the discovery of language and the incorporation of language into their lives, they were able to understand, and it sparked the imagination. And they became people who were creative and communicative.
They started telling stories.
Exactly. I think maybe, the first story somehow is like the beginning of language.
Yeah, I love thinking about that, and you've spent so much time articulating the value of storytelling. You've got this great line that says, what is involved in storytelling is awe, astonishment, imagination, belief, and holy dread. Those are your words. I'd love to know what you mean by holy dread. What's that about?
I think dread is an interesting concept, and it has its place in language. We are motivated by dread.
Really?
I think so, but partly. That's not the whole story, but it works well. Dread is something that is entirely human, it seems to me. We dread things. Fear is another concept that is at the root of language, I think.
That's interesting, and so maybe stories and language are a way to address fear, or a way to maybe prepare us to avoid certain things that we might otherwise have been afraid of. I do have this this sense of, as stories developed and got locked in over time, things that people said before there was actually storytelling, that changed over time, right? But stories, when it became story, and when it became written story, that sort of locked it in, right? I think of the book of Genesis, or I think of Beowulf, or things that you've written about before. Those were spoken for a long time, but the writing of it has put some limits on it, hasn't it?
Yes. When you talk about language before writing, you're really right down my alley, because I've spent virtually all of my teaching career teaching the oral tradition. And so the spoken word, I think, is we neglect it in our time. We don't appreciate it. But everybody has an oral tradition. Everybody has it. We speak. And speech and language are essential to literature. I think the greatest expression of the oral tradition in our time is drama, plays, because you have living people on the stage who are talking to each other and making contact, of course, with the audience as well. But that's a wonderful example of oral tradition.
Yeah, and other than that, is it still part of kind of who we are, or is it all kind of written down now?
Oh, no. I think there's a great deal of oral tradition that has not been written down. There are stories in oral tradition that are extremely inventive, and we have those. We don't think about them as much as we ought to, but yes. If you take, we have examples of written literature that did come from oral tradition. Beowulf is a good example, the first poem in English, but it was recited long before it was written down. We don't know how old it is, but it's a wonderful, wonderful piece of literature. So we have things like that, and we need to know more about it.
Yeah, and there are some things that they're better when you hear them, as opposed to when you read them.
Yeah.
And I think some of the stories that my grandparents used to tell, if I were to just read them now, I'd think, not so much. But to hear it come from those authentic voices,
yes,
it means a lot more.
If you should hear Hamlet, for example, on the stage, it makes a much greater impression than to the reading of it, I think.
Oh, I totally agree.
Yeah.
You know, your book, Housemaid of Dawn, was such a powerful story of this, the Native American experience in modern culture. Person comes back from war, doesn't fit in. Now there's this dominant culture. And he's trying to maintain, this character is trying to maintain his identity. There was that just hit at the right time, didn't it? With that's been the struggle continuously. But what was it about that novel at that time that you think resonated so well?
It told the story of a man who loses his identity, his traditional identity, and that in itself is a tragedy. But it was widespread during the Second World War. Say that's the time of the setting. That's the setting of Housemaid of Dawn. But so many young men of that generation were exposed to a world they had no knowledge of, and unfortunately, it was a world at war. So they were deeply damaged in many instances, and they came back to their homeland, and they were lost. Then there was this desperate struggle to recover the traditional world, and some did and some didn't. Abel, we don't know, because the ending is an open ending.
The ending is a little obscure there. You have to finish it yourself as the reader as to what happens.
Yes, I like that.
I do too. Rather than wrap up all the loose ends. No, when I read that ending, I thought, I respect that ending.
Oh, good. Okay.
But you didn't even know it was nominated for a Pulitzer.
No, I didn't.
Until you got the phone call, right?
I got the phone call from my editor at Harper and Row it was then. And she said, "Scott, are you sitting down?" And I said, "Come on, Fran, I'm busy. What do you want?" She said, "You've won a Pulitzer Prize." And I said, "Yeah, Fran, yeah, sure I have." And then it dawned on me that I really had. And it was a wonderful thing. It changed my life in certain ways. Brought me a lot of acclaim and recognition, and gave me an incentive to write some more. So I did.
Well, and what I think is interesting is were you thinking of yourself as a novelist at that time? It seemed to me that you were thinking of yourself as a poet, and you also had done this novel. So wasn't that a little bit kind of, wow, I wrote a novel and I'm not even a novelist?
Yes, that was very, very much on my mind. I did write poetry exclusively when I was at Stanford. With one exception, I did write a short story, but mostly poetry for like 3 to 4 years. And I found myself in a corner, and I wanted elbow room. So when I got my first teaching post at Santa Barbara, I began the novel. And it was a wonderful thing to do, this change of pace and so on. So I became a novelist. And that was not what I set out to be, but there it was.
So you had written yourself into a corner as a poet?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
So just thought, forget that. I'm going to go on and write a novel.
I got tired of writing poetry, and because that's all I did for those 4 years. And so I came out of Stanford thinking, I need more elbow room. I'm going to try something else. So I did.
Well, winning a Pulitzer for your first novel, especially when you don't actually consider yourself a novelist, that could have put enormous pressure on you, right? To say, okay, whatever I do now, I'm the Pulitzer Prize winning N. Scott Momaday. Or I think it actually worked the opposite for you. It just kind of freed you up to do what you wanted to do after that. Is that correct?
Yeah, once I had the novel under my belt, I felt free to go back to poetry. And I still consider myself a poet rather than a novelist. But I've written in so many different forms, I've plays and travel literature and essays and 2 novels and a good deal of poetry. And that's fine with me. I like that production.
It didn't put too much pressure on you. I think like Annie Dillard wins the Pulitzer Prize for her first book, Pilgrim to Tinker Creek, and she says that just raised the expectations so high for anything that she did after that she just felt all this pressure. You weren't that? You weren't that way?
I don't think so. The novel certainly did put some pressure on me because when I finished it, I was getting suddenly invitations to women's garden parties and invitation to write for different publications and so on. So it saved me from the parish.
Oh, the publisher parish kind of vibe.
Yeah.
Sure.
So I didn't have to worry about that. It gave me a kind of freedom. But yes, there was some pressure too. How do I follow that, you know? And I was aware of that, and I think it slowed me down for a time, but it didn't matter in the long run.
Well, because your second novel, Ancient Child, was not as popular as Housemaid at Dawn. Did that bother you that it didn't reach that same level?
Yeah, it did. It did because it's a fine novel. I think
it's a great novel.
I like it, and I got a bad review in the New York Times, and that did hurt. But the reviewer he wanted me to write another book, and I didn't write the one he wanted, so he was kind of hard on me, and it was not as well received as Housemaid of Dawn, certainly, but I'm proud of it. I think it would make a great movie, and I haven't convinced anybody of that yet. But it's very, you know, the character of Gray in that book is an interesting one. She's wonderful. She's
great.
Yeah, she's great. And of course, Billy the Kid is an old friend of mine. And so I got him into the novel. And
yeah, you certainly did.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, what I loved about the novel is that you did so many different things with time. You were in the present, and then clearly in the past with Billy the Kid, and then you were connecting all of these ancient myths that I've read of yours, you know, about the Kiowa people and all of these different, and you weave all of that together in this book. However, here's in that book you describe Gray trying to write. I think she was trying to write about Billy the Kid in this novel, and you say her experience was laborious, confusing, frustrating, and maddening. And then here's the quote: "But once in a while, she would write something that pleased her, that seemed very close to what she wanted, and that satisfaction was like no other that she knew. It was the satisfaction of having done what was in her to do, of having reached the best that was in her, of having been true to her purpose and herself." I'm guessing you've had that experience. You're describing your own experience there, right?
Exactly, yes. That's the way I feel about things. Writing can be laborious and hard, very difficult to do. But if you do it to your satisfaction, you know, there's no feeling that's better than that, I think. So that's the reward of writing.
But for writers, how often does that satisfaction actually occur? Are you one of these guys who just carves this pearl and it's awesome? Or are you struggling?
Once in a while, I write to my potential. And that's, I think I do anyway. And that's a great satisfaction. That's what keeps me writing. You know, makes everything worthwhile.
Wouldn't you think, after all that you've written over all these years, it would be more than once in a while?
Well, I suppose so. It's happened a good many times to me, and I'm very grateful for that. But I don't know. You know, in the long run, I'm not sure what of my work is really satisfactory to me. I achieve a certain level at times. And if it's a high level, if it meets my expectations and maybe exceeds them, that's great. That's, as I say, the justification for writing. But I'm sure that I've written quite a bit that doesn't satisfy me to that extent.
You've got another character in that book where you describe he's an artist, and you describe him almost in a kind of a manic state. You say he's afflicted, headed for a nervous breakdown. He was trapped to produce what the public wanted as opposed to what he wanted. Has that ever been you?
Yeah, I think so. Probably on occasion. Yes, I felt that I was doing something that wasn't my ambition particularly. There was an expectation that I would produce something of interest or value, and probably didn't satisfy me as much as I would like. The character you're talking about is fascinating to me because he's a mythic kind of man. He's an artist, and he has this bear power. So at the end, there's a transformation. He does turn into a bear, as I do on occasion. I have
read about it. I've never seen you turn into a bear,
but
I have read the accounts.
You don't want to see that. That's, run for your life if that happens.
It would be too much?
Too much.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, he does have these mythical qualities, but I love this line where it says what he wanted to do was to please and to astonish God with his paintings.
Can you have a higher ambition than that? That's a wonderful incentive and motive. And yes, to think that you have written something that might astonish God, that it's overboard, of course, but it says something about the nature of ambition and how the writer ought to work, I think.
That's you again?
Oh, yeah. Yes, I write to astonish God. And James Earl Jones.
Is there a difference?
Maybe not.
Maybe not. Oh, that's good. That's good. All right, let's go back to poetry for a second.
Yes.
So you go to Stanford to be a poet. You edited a collection and studied Frederick Tuckerman. Why Tuckerman? He was known primarily for one poem, right? Cricket?
Well, he was known for that poem, which was late in being discovered, I think it was in the middle of the 1900s, 1950 maybe, that publication was put out by the Covington Press. Mm-hmm. And my mentor at Stanford, Ivor Winters, wrote something about it in which he said, this is the greatest poem in English of the 19th century.
Really?
Yeah. So I got interested, of course, in Tuckerman, and I edited his work because he was not well known, but he was an excellent poet. So need to do something about that. And so I read him first on microfilm at Stanford, and then I went to Harvard and read his manuscripts and put them all together.
Yeah, I think at least what impressed me about his writing was his ability to describe landscapes, which I think is also one of your great gifts. Do you feel like maybe that influenced your ability to describe what we're seeing in the land ahead of us? He seemed to be really good at that.
I think that's an accurate statement concerning Tuckerman, but it's not a landscape that I write about.
Right.
He wrote about Greenfield and the Connecticut Valley and so on, which is a wonderful thing to write about. But it's not what I do. I write about a different landscape entirely.
True, but it was just his ability to draw a picture with words that impressed me. And different landscape, I totally get it.
Yeah.
But you do the same.
Well, I hope so. Yes. He was primarily a sonneteer. He wrote 106 sonnets or something like that, and his sonnets were brought out by Witter Binner in the 1930s, I want to say, and that was the only publication that was available to modern readers. He did publish a book of poems in 1860, And it was well received. He sent copies to Hawthorne and Melville and the literati of his time. And he traveled to England, I think, and met Alfred Lord Tennyson, who gave him a copy of Locksley Hall, I believe. So he was, in his lifetime, he was known well enough, but he became obscure very quickly, and very few people of my generation knew of Tuckerman.
Yeah.
So it was. I'm pleased that I edited his complete poems, because they deserve to be there. He fell again into obscurity. Can't help that, but at least his work is in libraries.
Yeah, there's a record.
Yeah.
And then you went to study Emily Dickinson's poems. What did she teach you as you immersed yourself into her creative genius?
Well, I don't know how to answer that. I think her impression on me was very great, but it would be hard to pin down. I think she's probably the greatest poet, the greatest American poet of all. And she's beyond imitation. You can't imitate her, but she's wonderful, wonderful poet. Her view of language was so wonderful, so compelling, and she wrote about so many. She wrote 1,700 poems. My goodness, and I read all of them.
Wow.
In manuscript. But I couldn't help being, and to spend a year at Amherst, which was her hometown.
Right.
That was very moving to me. I got to see the Pelham Hills, which she saw, and got to see where she had her garden, and it was just a wonderful thing. She's a great writer.
You have said about poetry that at its best, poetry is an act of disinterested generosity. What in the world does that mean? I love it. It resonates, but I don't know what it means.
It means that poetry is a gift that we make and give to other people. We share our love of poetry and our interest in it and our ability to write poetry. And it's an act of disinterested generosity in the sense that it's without prejudice. It's you say disinterested generosity. That means it's generosity that is not prejudiced. It's free. It's there. It's a gift.
And you can interpret it and absorb it however you can.
Yeah, however you will. Reading it, you can't help forming certain impressions about it, and that's a gift, as I say. Disinterested generosity. If you write a political document about, this statesman or that, or this party or that, it's prejudiced. It can't help being biased. But if you write a poem that has no bias, it's got a good chance of being a good or a great poem.
I love this other line of yours about poetry where you say, the poet says, "Here, let me show you something. Let me help you see something that you have not seen before." When you're writing a poem, is that in your mind? I want to show a reader something they have not seen before?
You want to take a subject and do something with it that has not been done before. Reveal a part of it that has been excluded, That's the purpose of literature, I suppose. Shakespeare would say, yes, that's what I do.
Well, I think Momaday says it too. We'll put Shakespeare and Momaday in the same category for that. So you've also written plays and a screenplay, and the screenplay was about the Carlisle School, the Indian school, and I'm still stunned by this statement that the mission of the school was kill the Indian, save the man. In what universe is that kind of a statement okay? But that was the goal of the school, right?
Well, it was the goal of the man who founded the school.
Okay.
That was his purpose. He wanted to. He meant well, but
Really?
Yeah, he wanted to bring the Indian into the modern world and to make him a part of the modern age. But it's a terrible statement. Kill the Indian and save the child. That's I killed a man. That's a. You're right about that. I mean, it's unthinkable, really.
So let's take away all of your cultural heritage. Let's take away all of your ancestry. Let's take away any memory you have of where you came from, and let's.
That is basically what Carlisle was about. Yes, they shave the heads of the kids and put them in uniforms and forbid them to speak their own language. It was a terrible thing. And the scars are very deep and great. You know, a lot of people were destroyed by the experience of the boarding school. Some benefited from it, and we don't know why or how, but that happens. And but many did not survive that experience. And as I say, cemeteries at those schools are there and poignant.
Still being discovered, those cemeteries.
Indeed, yeah.
So let's go back to storytelling for a moment. You've said, in Man Made of Words, you said, we have no being beyond our stories. Stories are pools of reflection in which we see ourselves through the prism of our imagination.
Wow, did I write that?
It wasn't Shakespeare, it wasn't Dickinson, it wasn't Tuckerman. It was Momaday said that. So, with that in mind, is that really the best way for us to know who we are, is through the stories we tell each other?
I think so. I think we express ourselves more deeply and more meaningfully in literature than in other pursuits. I'm not sure I know much about the other pursuits. I'm just guessing, but I do know that language and literature are fundamental, basic, essential to human being.
You've also said that stories have moral implications, and I'd love to know what you mean by that.
A story, a poem is a moral statement.
What does that even mean?
It means it has to do with the best that is in us, that what is right, as opposed to what is wrong. It's a gift again, a charitable gift. If I write a poem in which I express my spirit, and you read it, there's a good contact. There's something between us that matters and would not be there had it not been for the poem.
That puts a lot of responsibility on a writer, it seems to me.
Yeah, certainly. Yes, why write if you can't write, if you don't write responsibly? And that is a moral...
Why not just write something to entertain people? What's the matter with that?
Nothing. But it's not as high a form of expression as a poem, say.
Wow.
If you accept my definition of a poem is a statement concerning the human condition composed in verse. And that last tag is the thing that distinguishes poem. Verse is another word for measure. Poetry is measured. And the measure is what is finally important in the expression of the language. It has to have some kind of form, and it can have different kinds of form. You know, you can write in what we call blank verse, or free verse, but basically the form of the English poem, developed over hundreds of years, is tried and true.
Although you have evolved as a poet, I think you've said in recent years you've been freed up a little bit from rhyme and meter, from what you had been doing before. Is that an evolution that you like, or do you sometimes still play with needing to go back to rhyme and meter?
I go back to rhyme and meter quite often, but I think I'm very pleased with having brought elements of the oral tradition, the Native American oral tradition, especially, into my writing. It's valid. It's wonderful. It's not English verse, but it's a kind of expression that is based upon repetition largely, imagery, and more important than anything else, faith, an understanding that what you're doing is sacred.
Oh, we got to talk about that, because you have spoken of the sacred nature, not only of what you have described, but even the sacred nature of the creative act. It's always a theme in your writing, whether it's about the land or creation or about ancestors or about the human spirit. So what do you mean by the term sacred?
An understanding that that the earth, the environment, nature is composed of spirit. I wrote a book called Earthkeeper fairly recently, and in that I try to indicate that if we're going to save the earth, we're going to have to understand it's not enough to understand the crust of the earth on which we stand. We have to understand that it is supported by spirit. So that's sacred. That's sacred. And much of the experience of the Native American is sacred. And so it's a great thing to write about. It's endless.
But by sacred, you mean something other than the material, what we're standing on, this chair. There's another dimension, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you mean?
Yes, that's what I mean. I mean, the earth is composed of spirit. There's something spiritual about our existence. We don't understand enough about it.
You've got this great line that says, "The sacred is not a discipline, it is a dimension." And that is I think that's a theme pretty much in everything that you write, that you want to enter into that dimension. Mm-hmm. Is that accurate?
It is. I do want to get to that. That's there, and it should be not exploited, but made use of.
Do you have to kind of come to a place in your own spirit before you can actually get there, or as soon as you start creating, you're in that kind of cloud?
I don't know how to answer that, because on the one hand, you come into the world possessed of spirit. You come in completely innocent, and your whole being is it comes from a source that you have nothing to do with, and that is hard to recognize, but it is essential to your being. And that is an understanding of the spiritual nature of the earth. And I don't know that can be taught so well. You can't go and take a class in it. And
that's why it's not a discipline.
Right.
But when you sit down to write or paint,
mm-hmm.
do you just kind of collect yourself and say, okay, I need to tap into something before you get going?
No, that's a fair statement. I think it's when I write or paint, I'm working with something inside myself. I'm expressing a dimension of my experience that is sacred, that is spiritual, and that's very important. I couldn't work without that understanding.
Yeah. Now we're back to trying to astonish God, right?
Right. Yeah.
Because one of the other things on this same theme, you've said to encounter the sacred is to be alive at the deepest center of human existence. And my sense is when you're writing and when you're painting, you're coming alive, aren't you?
In a sense, yes. Yes, I feel more alive. I think, when I'm working, creating, expressing myself at the deepest level.
I would love to hear your account of you had an experience as a young man trying to climb down a rock wall,
Mm-hmm.
and you found yourself at the bottom, and you call that a sacred experience.
Yes, because I didn't understand how I got to the bottom. I lost consciousness, and I was in this situation where I was in great danger. I was suspended in a rocky chute on the side of a cliff, and it was an impossible situation because I knew that I couldn't stay there very long. I was pressing my arms out against the wall, and they were shaking. And
were you thinking, this is it?
Yeah, I was thinking, this is surely it. I'm not going to get out of this. And the next thing I knew, I was on the ground, looking up at this place, which was very high above me, and I don't know, something intervened in my existence and saved me. And I don't know what it was, but it was an interesting experience, a profound experience.
How did it change you?
I think it gave me a greater sense of myself, a greater appreciation of life, because I came very close to the end of it, but there it was, and there it is. So it was a transforming experience, and I don't know much more than that about it.
You just know that something happened.
Something happened. Yeah. I can't tell you what. I don't know how I made that distance from the chute to the ground. I was sitting on the ground looking up when I regained consciousness.
It's just remarkable to imagine all the possibilities of what could explain what happened there.
I have no explanation for it.
So you've got another line. I love quoting yourself to you because these things are just so profound. You've got this line in Man Made of Words: "Let us hold on to the wonder that excites the imagination. Let us not insist upon answers that will diminish our curiosity, that will kill our instinct for questions." I love that line, but my question is, how do we do that? How do we keep that sense of wonder and not settle for some cheap certainty?
I think we all have a potential for wonder, and the task is to appropriate that sense into our daily lives. We must recognize the wonderful when we see it. That is what nourishes the soul. There's a wonderful quote in The Great Gatsby, which I like to think about. Nick Carraway says at the end, fairly near the end of that book, he says, in one moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent. Compelled to an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in human history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. Wow. Wish I'd written that.
Yeah, that's pretty good, isn't it? That's pretty good.
Pretty good.
Oh, yeah. You've written some pretty good stuff that I think that I think is in that same category. I'd love this line of yours where you say, if just one poem stands the test of time, that's something that justifies your existence. We talked about that before, but I love it because that means you really reached something, right? A poem that stands the test of time. That's an accomplishment.
Yes, and it can be a great accomplishment. Like Tuckerman's Cricket, for example, that's one poem that justifies his whole existence. You know, and you can say that about very few poems, but there is one.
Yeah, but it gives you meaning. You can say, yeah, I did that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a work that you kind of point to that says, other than the Pulitzer, and maybe that's the validation, but where you say, that poem did it, that novel reached it?
What do you mean by did it?
That justified my existence. That's the one that's going to stand the test of time.
But it doesn't have to justify your existence to anyone but yourself.
Fair enough. But which one of yours does that?
Well, there are 2 or 3 candidates for that. There's one called Before an Early Painting of the Crucifixion, which is really, I spent a lot of time fashioning that poem, and it shows the kind of concentration I put into it. And there's another called The Bear, which did sort of justify me to other people. It was given the Academy of American Poets Prize at Stanford. I wrote it very soon after I got there, maybe in the second year that I was there. And it is a syllabic poem, and it is one of the best poems I've written, I think.
And you look back at that and say, that I did what I set out to do.
Right. Mm-hmm. I did it. And what a great satisfaction that is.
Yeah. I would love to know who you write for. Do you sit down and say, this is for children, or this is for people who need to love the land instead of use the land? Or do you just sit down and just start writing? Do you have an audience in mind?
You know, William Gass was asked that question, and his answer was just hit the nail on the head. He said, well, I don't write for myself because that's self gratification. I don't write for other people because that's pandering. I write for the thing that is about to be born. And I thought, yeah, that's what I should write for. Not for any visualized audience, but for the sake of the thing itself.
So like Housemaid at Dawn, you aren't thinking, this is totally going to win me the Pulitzer.
No, and it came as a complete surprise, as you know.
In that book,
yeah,
you have this character hearing his grandmother's stories, and this is how you describe it. When she told me those old stories, something strange and good and powerful was going on. I was a child, and that old woman was asking me to come directly into the presence of her mind and spirit. She was taking hold of my imagination, giving me to share in the great fortune of her wonder and delight. It was a timeless thing. Nothing of her old age or my childhood came between us. You had those experiences with your grandmother, didn't you? When she would tell you stories, or even your father.
Yeah, but primarily my father. He was steeped in the oral tradition of the Kiowas, and he told me stories when I was first able to understand them. And they made a great impression on me, and gave me the sense of the power of and beauty of language.
But that's part of the goal of a story, wouldn't you say, to erase that space between the teller and the hearer?
Yes, I would say that.
And it's just captured in this in this section so well. But you've had that experience listening to your father.
Yes, indeed.
Also, her words were medicine. They were magic and invisible. They came from nothing into sound and meaning. And I think you've described earlier, that's what language does. Something that comes from nothing into sound and meaning. That's a pretty hefty responsibility, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. Heavy responsibility. But it comes naturally to someone who is thinking in those terms, from sound into meaning. That's a wonderful transformation, and that's maybe one of the definitions of literature itself.
Yeah, it's just so powerful the way you've done it, and maintained a sense of the ancient myths, your ancestry, the land. You keep grounded in all of that. Is that a conscious effort on your part, or is that just, this is the prism through which I do all of my work?
It's the prism that I would like to inform all my work. Maybe I should say something about silence at this point, because there is a genuine place for silence in literature. It's not always what you express, but what you don't express that matters. And I had, a few years ago, the experience of going through the Altamira caves in Spain and seeing the pictures, the drawing, the paintings that had been on the walls there for thousands of years and never discovered, until very recently. But I was with my then wife, and we went through the caves. We came out of there and went to the car, and we could not speak. Could not speak for an hour, maybe. We just had to sit there and think about what we'd seen and what it meant, and trying to visualize the artist who put those things on the wall. That was a great experience, and I think you can apply that to literature. If you read something that leaves you breathless and silent, it's a good thing. It's how you measure great art, perhaps.
I think that's one of the ways you know that it's sacred.
Exactly, yeah. If you read Moby Dick, for example, I think it's hard to talk for a while after you read it, and that's because you're so impressed by it, moved by it. It's a great work of art, and you don't come across those things too often.
Mm-mm. You mentioned the paintings in the caves. You started painting well after you had written novels and poems and screenplays. What creative urge is going on there that you're working with brushes and ink and charcoal? What's that about?
It means that I had a long experience of drawing and painting when I was a child, because my father was a painter, and so I used to watch him work. And I wasn't interested in becoming a painter until I went to Russia. That opened a whole door for me, but I watched my father work, and I think I learned a lot by osmosis, just watching him and learning something. And finally I came to the point where I needed to express myself in those terms. I was in Russia. I felt isolated. I was very conscious of my distance from my native land, and so I began to draw, paint. And that was to relieve myself and to give myself some sort of anchor, which worked. It was successful.
But you're a different kind of painter than your father. I've seen your father's paintings, and they are very specific lines, straight lines. Yours are a little more...
messy.
Well, I wouldn't have said messy. I would have said less defined. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So why that? Why that approach? Why these kind of smudges as opposed to straight lines? I didn't mean that in an insulting way. It's just more, I can tell you're doing different things with the brushes than...
He did a kind of painting that I cannot do. I don't have the talent for doing the fine brushwork that he did. Two-dimensional, fine lines, as you say. I want to get down and start creating things that come out of my mind. They're not in conformation with any particular idea of painting. I just express what is in my view to paint. Spontaneous. I'm much more spontaneous than my father was.
Yeah, his would have been much more planned and meticulous.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think yours are beautiful because my imagination just runs with looking
good.
at the paintings that you do.
Good.
So a lot of people who will watch this video are aspiring writers. Some would be young people they think maybe they want to be a storyteller or something. Do you have any advice for people who want to write?
Well, I would tell them to prepare themselves by questioning their experience, trying to find out what it is made of, and to begin. The beginning is essential. If you write something, you want to put down the first word or the first sentence, and let the thing grow from there. And that's a trick, of course. And you shouldn't be afraid to imitate, as my mentor, one of my mentors, said, because you will eventually find your own voice, and that's what you really want to do.
I think you said about your own writing once that you write about these significant moments, and then you try to cast everything else away. Would that be part of your advice as well, is look for those moments? They don't all have to be ending up at the bottom of a cliff, but moments that say, this changed me, this marked me, this transformed me in some way. Would you advise people to start there?
If you can, yeah. If you can center upon a moment or a group of moments that are transforming, that's a good start. That's something that gives you a way to enter into writing or painting. Yeah.
You have this great exchange in the bear's house where Yahweh and this bear are discussing, and bear says, "Can you teach me to write?" Do you remember what Yahweh says?
He says, "I can teach you to write, but I can't teach you to write Moby Dick."
Why not?
Because that is such an original book, such a powerful act of the imagination that you can't find that, easily. So why not? Indeed, I don't know. It's a matter of being of astonishing God.
So 30 years ago, you recited a poem at UCSD. And I'm wondering if you could recite it again for us as we conclude.
This is the delight song of Tsuaitali. I am a feather on the bright sky. I am the blue horse that runs in the plain.
I am the fish that rolls shining in the water. I am the shadow that follows a child. I am the evening light, the luster of meadows. I am an eagle playing with the wind. I am a cluster of bright beads. I am the farthest star. I am the cold of the dawn. I am the roaring of the rain. I am the glitter on the crust of the snow. I am the long track of the moon in a lake. I am a flame of 4 colors. I am a deer standing away in the dusk. I am a field of sumac and the pomme blanche. I am an angle of geese in the winter sky. I am the hunger of a young wolf. I am the whole a dream of these things.
You see, I am alive. I am alive. I stand in good relation to the earth. I stand in good relation to the gods. I stand in good relation to all that is beautiful. I stand in good relation to the daughter of Saint Tainte. You see, I am alive. I am alive.
Scott Momaday, thank you for being with us at our Writers' Symposium.
Thank you for coming to my home. It's been a pleasure.